Meanwhile, Iran is reacting to an Ontario court decision on flight PS752. The Foreign Ministry spokesperson is calling it shameful. An Ontario judge ruled that Iran intentionally committed an act of terrorism when it shot down the flight. The ruling was in connection with a civil claim by some families who lost loved ones in the crash. Now, Iran brought down the flight with 2 surface-to-air missiles in January of last year. All 176 people on board were killed, including 55 Canadian citizens and 30 permanent residents. And while some are welcoming the Ontario court's decision, it's not without its controversies. Some experts are concerned about how the decision was made and how it could complicate other families' search for justice. Kaveh Shahrooz is a lawyer and human rights activist. He's a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and he joins me now. Thank you so much, Kaveh, for making the time.
Thanks for having me on.
I want to dive into the ruling, but first, perhaps, and get your reaction to the announcement of Professor Akhavan's appointment.
Oh, it's fantastic news. And in the last hour or so, I've received a number of messages from family members who lost loved ones, and they're all very happy with this. There are very few people in Canada who have the expertise and knowledge that Professor Akhavan has. So I think this is a very good development.
And what's your reaction to the foreign ministries of Iran's reaction to the court, saying that there was no jurisdiction on this case, calling the decision shameful? Perhaps not a surprising response from Iran.
Yeah, not at all surprising. I mean, I've read their statement, but frankly, I didn't even need to read it because I knew what they would say. They would say that this was a political decision because Iran's officials don't understand the concept that we have an independent judiciary here. And they will claim, and they did claim, that our court has no jurisdiction, which it very clearly does. So I dismiss any statement that Iran's regime makes. Iran's regime obviously shot the plane down. It tried to hide evidence. It didn't cooperate with any investigation. That's not surprising. But the judgment that came out yesterday, I think it's a good step forward, but there are complications.
Well, let's talk a bit about this, because I wondered when I saw the headline and then dug a bit deeper how meaningful this is, because it's a civil action, so the burden is lower. It's balance of probability as opposed to beyond a reasonable doubt. And this was a default judgment, right? Iran didn't contest. There was no defense presented, for lack of a better word. So how meaningful is a decision like this one in your view?
Well, meaningful in the sense that, I mean, it is a judgment by an Ontario court, and to the extent that, the Iranian regime has assets in Canada, they can certainly be seized. But I think, precisely for the reasons that you mentioned, Iran didn't actually put up a defense. The Canadian government didn't intervene in the case. The balance of probabilities was the test, not reasonable doubt. All those things leave one a little bit unsatisfied. And I think it's going to be difficult to collect on this judgment. And I think there's going to be some complications, some complexities when the families, beyond the 4 plaintiffs in this case, try to seek justice in other fora.
So walk me through that. What are the implications? Like, this was a small subset of the families involved in this case. What are the implications for the broader group? Because there are these negotiations on reparations. There could be other actions. What does this judgment mean for those other parallel processes if they were to happen?
I think there are a few concerns. So one, with respect to these particular plaintiffs, I think they're going to have some trouble collecting on this decision. I don't know if Iran has any assets in Canada. I suspect not, and it will be difficult to find. And if they try to enforce this judgment in foreign jurisdictions, I think they're going to find it difficult to do so, to find Iranian assets and seize them. I think other jurisdictions are probably going to be less accommodating of the victims. I think the other problem is that other international fora may be less likely to view this as a terrorist action, as the judge in Ontario found. And I think Iran may make the argument that, the victims have access to a domestic remedy in Ontario's courts. They've demonstrated that they can, achieve justice that way. So why even negotiate with Canada, or why negotiate with the families? I think that's going to be a challenge.
I used the word meaningful earlier to describe the judgment. I guess I wonder if conclusive might be a better word, right? Because it says it was intentional. It describes it as terrorism, but there are these other investigations. So, I mean, what should people draw from this definition and this labeling from this particular court decision as we try to look at the broader controversy of the downing of this flight?
Well, I think, the decision tells you that there is reason to suspect that this may have been intentional. I think the judge went beyond that and said, I believe on balance of probabilities that it was intentional. It drew from some reports that have not ruled out the possibility of intentionality. So I think that issue is still alive. It's worth thinking about. But I think there's a long road ahead for justice, and I've been speaking to some family members, telling them that this quest continues. And I think the families themselves, certainly they're very happy with this result, but financial compensation has never been top of the list. They've wanted accountability, and they've wanted the truth, and they've wanted people held responsible, high-ranking officials of Iran's regime held responsible. And unfortunately, this judgment doesn't really deliver that.
I wonder if you can give us a sense of some of the evidence that was heard. You mentioned these reports that did not rule out that there could have been an intentionality behind this tragedy. I mean, other than the reports, there were a couple of political analysts and airline captain that testified or were consulted throughout these hearings. I mean, are they expert analysts on things like the missile system that was used and is sort of an incident?
Not on the missile system. So the judge in the case made reference to about 4 different reports. One put out by Ralph Goodale, the other by Agnes Calmar, who is the former UN Special Rapporteur. And the judge cited it as evidence that this was intentional. But if you look at those reports don't actually say it was intentional. They simply leave that possibility open. And the 2 political analysts, one I happen to know, he's a great analyst, but he's not a technical analyst. And I think this is really one of those cases that requires technical analysis and knowledge of the missile system and how it was used. And that kind of information, unfortunately, was absent in the judgment.
So when you look at the judgment and you look at the level of evidence that was there, and it is balance of probability, so it is lower a standard than, say, a conclusive guilty verdict in a criminal court. I mean, when you look at the evidence, is there, I don't know if the phrase smoking gun is the right one to use, but was there that level of evidence presented in this Ontario court?
No, certainly there is no smoking gun. To my knowledge, no smoking gun has been revealed to date. I mean, we're still waiting for some analysis to be conducted or released by the Canadian government. Maybe there will be some smoking gun evidence there. At the moment, it's simply the best of our knowledge. And I think that's really one of the reasons why Canada's government ought to keep the pressure on, because we want Iran to cooperate with this investigation, to give us evidence, and for us to be able to analyze this and maybe take this to international fora like the International Court of Justice.
Just one final point before we let you go. I mean, what do you think happens next with this particular investigation and with this story? Well,
I think things are going to move on parallel tracks. With respect to this judgment, I think these plaintiffs and their counsel are going to try to obviously make the case for high levels of compensation and try to seize Iranian assets. As I mentioned earlier in the interview, that's going to be a challenge. On a separate track, I think there's going to be direct negotiations. Professor Akhavan, you mentioned, he's going to be involved with those, and I'm excited about that. I think he's well situated to do that. And I'm hopeful that this either moves to the international body that oversees civil aviation, or moves to the International Court of Justice.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Kaveh Shahrooz, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.